It's World Politics Time. As y'all can tell, I'm in the studio with Sasha and Adam. So I'm going to bring them up so they can talk about some of these world issues and all along those lines. But I'm going to bring them up as I get to my destination and all along those lines. I know a lot of people are talking about a lot of different things and all along those lines, but I'll bring in Sasha as well as Adam, and then I'll bring the lead of the discussion once I get to my destination. But really quickly, we'll have them talk about their thoughts of what's going on. So, Adam, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and I'll be into the room letting things be led once I get to my destination in about 2 minutes. But I'm gonna let you and Adam have a conversation.
Adam, hurry up. You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'll say three things. First, the campus protests across the country are a disgrace. I'm not sure what these protesters' parents did when they were raising them, but they obviously didn't do a good job. I'm not sure what these university professors did in indoctrinating them. They likewise failed. This is not protected by the First Amendment. It's disrupting the educational experiences for all students, placing Jewish students at risk, and it's simply intolerable in any society that values liberty and democracy. Second, the Trump trial is also a disgrace because Trump didn't commit any crime whatsoever, and he's being tried in a jurisdiction that's 85% Democratic, with a Democratic judge and with a liberal jury. This is the antithesis of due process, and it compromises the rule of law and any faith we have in the integrity of our judicial system. And third, if Joe Biden is reelected in 2024, this country is in deep trouble. Biden is incompetent. He should not be in the White House. And we need someone with pragmatic policies, such as securing the border, putting people back to work, lowering taxes, gaining respect abroad, lowering gas prices, lowering inflation, that's going to make America great again and make the average person feel like they are a part of this country.
Wonderful, Adam. I enjoy every moment of your speech. It's wonderful. And I would like to actually agree with everything what you say, except a couple of minor things. Look, I'm not a big fan of Biden. And he's making some mistakes. He's doing certain things that could be easily criticized. And of course, he is in the forefront of everything what's happening in America right now. He can be criticized for borders, for protests, for Israel situation, for not delivering on time its weapons to Ukraine, and Afghanistan withdrawal. So you just name it. You don't have to really look into something to find what Biden is responsible. And if, in my opinion, if Republican Party would be led by just like by nobody, Nikki Haley could be that, or what's his name, DeSantis. That doesn't matter as long as it's not Donald Trump, the felon who who is lost. Everything is life. What one man can lose. How much one man can lose in his life to name him as the ultimate loser of the modern era. He lost all his father's money. He lost the 6 bankruptcies in casino. He lost 2 impeachment. And, just name it, this disgrace of January 6th and so on. And you know what? It doesn't pass a smell test. It's just so smelly. I am not talking about that he's farting in courtroom. Okay, that's fine. So he's old man, and so he's farting from time to time. That could be forgiven, actually. Also, who knows? Maybe Biden farts just as well. We don't know that, but but because Biden is not in a courtroom proceeding, so everybody could be observed to hear and listen to him every time and so on. Is, actually, the Trump, it's only one way I can see. Actually, he may win election because on Thursday they will. He was fined for 9 court violation, violating the gag order, and there are 4 more will be on. So he was fined $9,000. That's for him. It's nothing. It's the annoyance of telling somebody to write checks and to deposit it somewhere. So it's a nuisance. However, there will be 4 others in Thursday. He may lose even one or a couple of those, and that could be a jail term. And jail term, I think that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to annoy the judge to so much degree. So he would put him, doesn't matter, for half an hour, for a day, for 7 days, for some short period of time. He's not going to put him for 5 years, right? And that will be a great event for Trump, where he's saying, look, I'm suffering for all of you. So now, when you will elect me a president, I will do everything right, and I will take care of all these radical Republicans and all these judges and prosecutors and so on. Let's do it together, and that's how actually he may win the presidency.
Hey, Sasha
Okay?
and Adam,
Well,
I'm back
well-
in the. Uh-huh.
I just want to say a few things in response to that. To the American people, we are living in an era that is worse than the Joe McCarthy era. Make no mistake, it is worse than the Joe McCarthy era.
In some
Never
respects,
in the history of this country has the media, academia, and the progressive left viciously attacked one man relentlessly, day after day after day after day, and used the rule of law to weaponize our judicial system against a single person when they would have never brought these charges against anybody else. It's a violation of due process, equal protection, and it is selective prosecution. And when you use the rule of law to target a specific candidate, like Letitia James and Alvin Bragg said they would do in their campaign, you have a recipe for fascism that's even worse than Russia. And this is coming from the people that claim to value diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are hypocrites. Now, let's look at Trump as president. Trump appointed 3 people to the U.S. Supreme Court who are among the most brilliant scholars in this country. Inflation was much lower. Taxes on corporations were lower. The border was secure. African American and Hispanic employment rate was at its lowest rates in history. The economy was excellent. There were no wars, no terrible withdrawals from Afghanistan. We had peace here, domestically and internationally, and we also had prosperity. And the way that Donald Trump has been attacked, called a racist, a sexist, by people like Stormy Daniels, a porn star who extorted him, and E. Jean Carroll, who's about as intellectually unstable and mentally unstable as they get, is a disgrace. This country is killing itself from within, and it's about time we start realizing that we're better when we're the United States of America, not the divided states of America. And for that to happen, Trump needs to be reelected in 2024.
Well done, well done. We'll see. Election is coming, and if he will be able to convince all the undecideds and all the battle states, where election will be decided, and these people will say, yes, Trump is our president. Get away, Biden. We don't want you anymore. Yeah, all the way he'll win. Doesn't matter that he will be in jail at the time, but it doesn't matter really.
He's sticking around. He's heading out.
No. Actually, he will pardon himself immediately once he's in jail and he's reelected. That jail is West Palm Beach, not
as he should, because
yeah.
I'll give you an example. If I was walking down the street and there were people exercising their First Amendment rights, and they were disseminating speech that I thought was offensive, disgraceful, and distasteful, I would say they have a right to do it. If the state was prosecuting a person that I hated, that I thought should be in prison, that I thought was the worst person on the face of the earth, I would still say that person deserves due process like everybody else does. What these people are doing in Florida, in Washington, D.C., in New York, what they're doing is not prosecuting Trump. They are persecuting him by using laws in ways that have never been used against Trump when they have never used the laws against anyone else in this manner. And most importantly, the reason they're doing it is not to uphold the rule of law or because no one is above the law. It's to keep Trump out of the White House. And when you use the law for political purposes, you are Vladimir Putin's Russia. And that is what we're becoming.
Adam, of course, you understand this subject much better than I do. I don't know American laws, and I'm surprised that you're saying there is no due process. But look, there are four different cases, and so many indictments or so on. So how they were able to indict him for so many times if he hasn't done anything wrong? How does it work? I mean, which laws do they apply to get so many indictments?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I'm really, really tired of places like MSNBC and CNN saying Trump has 91 felony charges against him and all these 4 indictments against him. Well, the American public should actually be told the truth about what it takes to get an indictment. And the answer is very little, if nothing. It simply requires that a prosecutor go to what's called a grand jury, which is similar to a jury, present the charges, and ask the grand jury to return an indictment. During the indictment process, the defense is not permitted to be present. The defense is not permitted to speak. Well, that's a good question. Again, it goes to my due process argument. The defense is not allowed to submit any information. The defense is not allowed to present any witnesses. The defense is not allowed to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses. The prosecution is not required to adhere to the rules of evidence. The prosecutor is not required to disclose exculpatory information. In other words, it's a process that is stacked 100% in favor of the prosecution. And that is why there's a statement in this country that says a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. These indictments show that that statement is accurate.
Hey, Adam,
it's happened 4 times. It's scary because,
well, it's happened 4 times. In 3 of those 4 jurisdictions, they were almost exclusively liberal Democrats who were in charge of deciding A, if he's charged, B, if he's indicted. So obviously, when you bring it in Atlanta, Georgia, and Fulton County, the District of Columbia, and liberal Manhattan, of course, they'll not only indict a ham sandwich, they'll indict the figment of their imagination if they don't agree with it politically. And that's why when you politicize the rule of law, you not only compromise the very purpose of the rule of law and the integrity thereof, you destroy the public's perception and confidence in the legitimacy of our institutions. That is the point, and that is indeed the problem.
Hey, Adam, just really quickly, and it's somewhat related, but not totally. I was, as y'all could tell, on the bus earlier, and I saw one of my activist friends that I run across every once in a while because she gets around by mass transit just like I do, and she's getting ready to graduate. I think she said she had one paper left, a few papers left, and then she'll graduate, I want to say, from UNC or Duke, and all along those lines. I'm not sure where she stands on the Palestine issue, but I do know that on her shirt was this notion of abolishing prisons, and that's something that people have been thinking about for a while. So I just wondering, as a lawyer, do you think that we should get rid of the prison system? And then I'll come back to the Trump trial as well. But do you think that we should abolish prisons? Because that was something she had on her shirt, and I know she's been an advocate of because of the way the prison system is.
The position that we should abolish the prison system is outrageous. It is absolutely outrageous for the following reasons. Okay. Number one, there's really, really evil people in society who do really, really evil things like murder, rape, sex trafficking, child pornography. They are a threat to public safety, and as such, they should be put in prison. Because if they're not, they will keep offending, and society will become less safe and less stable. Now, if you are talking about prison reform, that's a different issue. Certainly, there's areas where we can inform our carceral system. The first area is sentences for some crimes, particularly drug crimes, are too long. The second is that prisons themselves often present inmates with inhumane conditions in which they're raped, sexually assaulted, and live in squalor. And that's inconsistent with human dignity and the dignity that this country should reflect. But having said that, and the third thing is, yes, maybe there's some crimes for which alternatives to punishment would be preferable, like maybe drug rehabilitation services to drug offenders instead of putting them in prison, because when they get out of prison, they have no money, they have no job. Guess what they do? They reoffend. In some cases, they commit suicide. So prison reform is different than prison abolition. Abolition makes no sense because there are evil people, and public safety needs to be protected by getting them off the streets. But prison reform is sensible to not only maintain the dignity of our prison conditions, but to make sure when these people get out of prison, they have a chance to succeed in life so they won't reoffend again. That makes everybody safer.
No, and on those same lines, I just recently heard earlier today, that there is a motion, and I think Biden is behind it, to lower the severity of marijuana. And I know that we'll have some people, including one that does a show here on the network. We have Weeds Wednesday that I believe it's Jeff Eichen is involved with, and all along those lines. But definitely that would be probably maybe a positive news. But what are your thoughts around this? Because apparently they're about to declassify it or classify it as a less heinous crime and all in that space. So that it just came down the pike today. I think that they approved that.
It depends on whether you're talking about people who use drugs or people who sell drugs. Mm-hmm. I would support reducing penalties and even alternative diversionary programs for people who, say, are addicted to drugs, because the goal should be not just to stick them in a prison cell and then release them after a year, whereby they're going to go right back to drugs. Nobody else is safer, and that person's future is non-existent. But in that situation, therefore, I would support a more rehabilitative approach. However, for people who sell the drugs, I would put them in prison, because they are the catalyst and they are the cause of what has led to the death of millions of people and a crisis of addiction in this country that has been made worse by an open border where fentanyl flows in freely and Biden has done nothing about it. It's time for change. It's time for Trump.
Well, I want to get back to Trump, and I want to get back to your favorite person, Mr. Sasha, and everything, and that is Putin, because apparently Brittany Griner, the basketball player, was in the news. She's got an interview that I think will be airing tomorrow on 2020, but she says the U.S. government should have gotten imprisoned Marine Paul Whelan in the trade for Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, doing a teaser for that interview that will air. And she said that she wishes that she wasn't the only person that was released at the time that she was released, and now she is pursuing her career in basketball. And I think she's also an expectant mom, if I remember correctly, and all along those lines, or maybe her wife is, but one of them is having a kid, and all in that space. And then on that same line, your favorite person, Mr. Vladimir Putin, who I know Adam is a big fan of, said that on Tuesday that the United States was being hypocritical by imposing the International Criminal Court's investigation of Israel, but supporting the court's warrant for the arrest of President Vladimir Putin. So apparently he's saying that they're playing both ends of the stick, because they won't support the warrant for Netanyahu, but they will support the warrant for him and everything. So I don't know your thoughts about both of those matters, because definitely we talked earlier today about the international courts and whether they even have.
I would like to bring a third matter. If you're discussing Vladimir Putin, yesterday there was an attack with a lethal systems. It's a missile by the name Iskander, which was used for nothing more than a civil target. It was a building in my hometown of Odessa, killing 5 people and maiming 30 people. That was single purpose used to kill innocent civilians. There was no other targets in that vicinity rather than this building. So that was obviously what Putin is doing to innocent civilians in Ukraine. However, the American help is on its way. It's already in Europe. In some of it is already in Ukraine. Some of it is in Poland. Some of it is in Germany and will be delivered to Ukraine very quickly. And I think that Putin is there for a rude awakening when he will realize what's waiting for him and his so-called army.
Any
Well,
thoughts on that, Adam?
yes, President Putin, once again, is correct. The United States approach to the International Criminal Court is the epitome of hypocrisy. Let's take an example. George W. Bush committed war crimes when he lied about the reasons why we were going into Iraq a second time, when, as a result, over 100,000 Iraqis were killed, and they still suffer those effects today. The government was destabilized. Thousands of U.S. troops were killed. And Saddam Hussein was hung like an animal, okay, by his political rivals. George W. Bush is the one who should be before the International Criminal Court. Yet the United States has the audacity to say they won't submit to the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, but they're going to try to dictate who should be. So, in keeping with their hypocrisy, they shield Netanyahu and they go after Putin. Why are they doing it? Solely to protect their national interests, not out of principle, fairness, or any semblance of purpose. It's a disgrace. It undermines our credibility. And if the International Criminal Court itself is to have credibility, it has to begin with issuing arrest warrants and convictions in absentia for all leaders of all countries, whether signatories or not, to the court who commit these crimes, because without the existence of an equal and fair administration of the law, any prosecution is tainted with illegitimacy, and that is the case here.
Adam, could you elaborate on what are, in your opinion, American interests?
American interests are to shield its political leaders from any form of punishment and any optic that would make the United States look bad on the world stage. So essentially, what they're using the International Criminal Court for is not for justice, but for power. They're using the International Criminal Court as a way to weaken and prosecute, or shall I say, persecute their enemies, while doing whatever they want, like George W. Bush did in the Second Iraq War, with impunity. It's wrong, and again, it's the point and the problem.
Hey, really quickly, I saw Rick joins us as well, but we've got another part of the world that is playing a part in the politics as well, and that is China. And apparently Blinken is over there, and apparently we are letting the folks in China know how much we enjoy their culture and everything, because one of the articles I was reading said that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made Chinese cuisine a central part of her last 2 trips to Beijing, hosting a lunch with an all-female lineup of Chinese economists on one occasion and dining on the famous Yunnan mushroom dishes on another. On his visit last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken took in some basketball, and we do know that there are some Chinese basketball players, and brought albums at a local Beijing record store. And apparently both trips are seeking to humanize the bilateral relationship and perhaps signal to the Chinese people that Americans have a fondness for all sorts of things about China, even if that doesn't extend to the government, because we know that many folks are not fans of the government style of China and what style of politics they have. But despite, and this is where I found it interesting, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Adam, and anybody else who wants to jump in, because despite the increased bilateral tensions and the fears in China about gun violence and anti-Asian discrimination in the U.S., there are nearly 300,000 Chinese students electing to study at U.S. universities each year. And by contrast, the number of U.S. students studying in China has plummeted to a new low since the pandemic, with only about 900 U.S. students currently studying in China. So should we be trying to get more of our students over there and more and less of their students over here, or should we be increasing this, or what's going on? Because apparently they are trying to let folks know that we enjoy their ways of life. Any thoughts about that? Because you are at a university, actually you're at a couple of universities, Adam, and you maybe see some of these Chinese students. And like I said, I'm near Duke and I see a few of them as well. But your thoughts as well.
I think we need to equalize trade relations with China so that they're bearing more of the burden and we're bearing less of the cost. But when it comes to students, no, I'm not in favor of supporting more students going over to China because I believe that the educational institutions in the United States are the best in the world. And that's why I think people come to the United States more than we go abroad. Now, certainly there's amazing institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, all over the world. But the best institutions are in this country: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, Penn, Northwestern, Berkeley, UCLA. Okay? So people come to the United States because the United States provides them with opportunities they don't get elsewhere. And the people who are protesting today, yesterday, and the day before that should take note of that. This is the best country on the planet that affords the most opportunity to people to allow them upward mobility into the middle class and to have a future for themselves and their children when they wouldn't have it where they came from. This country is not bad. This country is not racist. This country is not sexist. This country is not unduly capitalist or patriarchal. This country is what allows people to go from nothing to something. And before they put up their signs and spew their hate, maybe they should think about the country which allows them to do that and show a little bit more gratitude.
Well, one of the things that
hold on. So
go ahead, Rick.
The U.S. has a huge competitive advantage in the quality of our higher education. Because we have 4% of the world's people, and if we can attract the best of the rest of the world to come here, we can, some of these people will, so you got on the one hand, great schools, on the other hand, great lifestyles. If you can come here and then stay here and use your talents in America, because America is a kick-ass place to live, that's a huge advantage. And yeah, when America starts presenting itself to the world as a bunch of bigoted yahoos, that cuts down on our advantage.
Yeah, but in that same way and everything, because and I'm definitely going to get to something that Whoopi Goldberg said about that in a second. But before I get to that, just one of the things I was curious about is there seems to be a movement, and I think Sasha has alluded to it. Some people would say that Ukraine is part of it, into like a populist mindset, and that is a global thing because apparently populists are mobilizing against the elite, they're protesting against globalism, and apparently they employ a lot of what some people would consider belligerent rhetoric and all into that space. But what is your thoughts around this rise of populism? Because that is not just a thing in the U.S. I would argue that that's the worldwide. Some people would say that that's part of what Brexit was about, and definitely what some of the other rebellions throughout the world have been about as well. But are we heading toward a more populist style of politics?
Well, I think that each country has to look at its own problem and find a solution to it. Let's take protests in United States. Actually, there are some protests in Canada. Mm-hmm. Canada is not insulated. However, in Canada is very different thing. For example, in Toronto, there are no protests. There are some protests in Montreal, McGill University, and they have to formulate exactly what they're protesting against and present their case, and it will be listened to and then to be, I don't know, rejected or resolved. I'm not so sure how it's going to work out. In Toronto, what was interesting is that there were anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli, you can call them protests or some kind of gathering of people. Okay, let's put it this way. And it was very quickly discovered that most of them are taking place around or near synagogues in Toronto. So I don't know if it's just a membership of the synagogue, or there were some other people involved as well. Basically, what they were doing, they very quickly, once they were 3 or 4, like very few, this so-called pro-Palestinian protesters, they immediately mingled against them, disseminated them, and called the police immediately to arrive. Police was arriving very quickly in a matter of minute and a half, and all these protesters, they were dispersed, and there were nothing at all to speak about it. I understand that New York is a very different city from Toronto, and also it's taking place on campuses. So again, I'm not so sure what are the regulations of the campuses. Is that possible that people will have this vocal protests and bother the ongoing people, including Jewish students, and so on? How does it work?
But Sasha, you said that there were no protests, and I just looked it up. There was since Saturday, McGill University in Montreal has been trying to deal with an encampment on their campus. So apparently there's one there. And on Monday, activists announced that they were setting up occupations at the University of British
Mark,
Columbia.
you have a point. You got it. I was wrong. Sorry, there were protests in Montreal, McGill. So I mentioned something like this, but I was not so detailed and not
Well,
so.
I'm just saying that there were some, and there's even a group, Toronto for Palestine is an Instagram account.
How many people were there in McGill? What, 10,000, 100,000, million people? How many were there?
I mean, there were different amounts depending on where they were and everything. I mean,
I
they
was
even said a pro-Palestine protest shut down Justin Trudeau's reception at a Toronto museum. And that was
Let's go back to nationalism.
yes,
So-
nationalism.
We know that widespread nationalism is a terrible thing after what happened in the 20s through the 40s of last century. Everybody turned nationalist and fascist, and the world caught on fire. Russia wants Western democracies to be who have a lot of internal anger, and also anger at the rest of the world, because that gives Russia, makes us, if we're fighting with each other, it makes us ignore Russia. Right now, we got 2 wars that America pays attention to. There are other wars in Africa, Rwanda, and others, but we have one war is entirely unjust, which is Russia against Ukraine. And then the war of Israel-Gaza is semi-just. Israel was certainly justified in responding to what Hamas did, but it's pursuing the war in using somewhat unjust means. The good thing about, they're both terrible wars, but Ukraine's been going on for 27 months. Israel, 7 months. And it's easier to imagine Israel-Gaza coming to an end because you're talking about such a tiny piece of land that it shouldn't take forever to reach some kind of resolution. And one of the reasons it's taking longer than that is because Netanyahu's out of a job as soon as the war ends.
Well, Mark, let me
sorry, just one thing, Rick. I would disagree with you about Netanyahu because the war cabinet, where Netanyahu just one of the people, and there's members of the opposition who are serving in the war cabinet. They are all supporting what Israel is doing. Israeli population, 99% support what Netanyahu and government is doing. And I'll tell you, to end this war, it's very easy indeed. If Hamas would release all the hostages, that would be a huge move to a peaceful solution of the problem.
But the Hamas isn't rational, and they're not. They're murderous people.
Rick, you know what? Somebody by the name Adolf Hitler was not too rational either. And you know what's happened? There were so many Germans were being killed and maimed and raped just in 45. From January to May 1945, millions were killed. And you know what stopped killing of Germans? The unconditional capitulation. That what solved all the problems with Germany. So here, if Israel would get their goal to elimination of Hamas and unconditional capitulation, and surrender of Hamas, that would end everything and release of the hostages. Short of that, nothing will stop this war. Full stop period. And all these protests or so on, it's not going to work.
Well, you bring up
one thing. Go ahead.
Well, just briefly, you bring up Adolf Hitler. What do you think that these campus protesters are advocating for? The very same thing, the destruction of Israel. And I would submit that to the American people, go to Ukraine, go to Russia, go to England, go to Ireland, Scotland, Austria, Australia, France, Belgium. You know what you're going to find? You're going to find intelligent, average citizens who know history, who know their culture, and who are responsible, good people. In this country, we have an epidemic of stupidity, and that stupidity has been fomented and exacerbated by an academia that is more interested in indoctrination than developing critical thinking skills. And the product of that is precisely what you see now at Columbia, at Berkeley, at UCLA, at North Carolina. And that is the seeds of disaster for democracy. If it were up to me, you know what I'd say? From the river to the sea, throw them in prison and throw away the key.
Well, so, I mean, yes, so a lot of the protesters, maybe even a majority of the protesters, don't even know what from the river to the sea refers to.
They even don't know very often what they are protesting against.
Yeah.
Therefore, overheard the conversation between two girls protesters, and one are asking the other one, "What are you protesting against?" She says, "Oh, I'm not so sure." Okay, we'll find out. So, if you will look at the organization, all the stands, same color, and some of them have toilets, as the way I understand. And somebody must have organized it, supplied, buy it, erected, and put it over there. So it's not just protesters themselves, boys and girls, who are there. I'm not trying to defend them. But what I'm saying is that there is much more behind it than we think about it.
But there are big differences between the attitudes of Hamas and the attitudes of Germans. Germans, for the most part, didn't want to die in defense of their country. Hamas seems to be okay for the most part with being martyred and with martyring people around them. And they to be okay.
They are responsible for all these 30,000 Palestinians killed. Only Hamas. Nobody else is responsible. Hamas has to take responsibility for all the Palestinians killed in this horrible.
And for those who talk about a two-state solution, it hasn't happened because Hamas doesn't want it, because their goal is not two states, it's one state and the destruction of Israel. And what Hamas did on October 7th, the way they raped, tortured, killed families, put children in ovens, is a disgrace. And these protesters who support Hamas, they claim to be about diversity and inclusion and protecting marginalized populations and rooting out systemic racism. Well, what do you think they're doing against the Jews right now?
But
they are marginalizing them and spreading the very hate that they claim to condemn. No. They are hypocrites. They are bad people, and they are anathema to any society that values freedom, liberty, and intellectualism.
I think I have a solution to this protest. If you will take all the protesters and just throw them to jail, let them get lawyers who will charge $25,000 retainer to prove that they're innocent, that they have freedom of expressions and all that stuff. Let them go through the hoops, and whoever supplies all the tents, maybe they will supply legal fees for them to pay. But let them go.
Sasha, there have been hold on a second, Sasha. There have been entire organizations that have done that, because even in North Carolina, we had the moral Mondays, and yes, there were people that were intentionally getting arrested because it is a form of civil disobedience. So they were going into the state capitol and they were intentionally getting arrested. And yes, they did have legal teams, and yes, there are teams of folks that will supply the money to address the legal causes. And I'm sure that that's even
But
what
Mark,
the protesters here have as well, and everything. So there are definite legal.
these protesters have no case.
Trace, and you guess that the money will be supplied. So there is a money trace. Who is supplying money? How they are supplying money? Are they using crypto to supply money or some other device? What's the purpose of this money transfer? It's very easy to investigate.
I mean,
So-
and there are some people that are
so
doing that
I'm holding
investigation.
up-
There are some people that are looking at that and everything. But I will say, to the point that I made earlier, there are some people that have brought up, and I have brought it up again, and I'll bring it up this time, that
And
there
one
are
question.
folks that have thought that Hamas was actually funded by Netanyahu, and there is no doubt
Okay,
about that.
okay, it's garbage, Mark. You know that.
It's
I
not
have
garbage.
one
It is
question.
whether the Israeli government was backing it because they wanted to break up the
Why?
Palestinians.
Sorry.
They wanted to break up the PLO.
I have
That
a
is not
question
garbage.
for
That is the
Adam.
truth. You can check the facts.
Mark, go to Palestine and Israel and figure out what's happening there.
I've
Because
got
you
friends on both sides, so don't go there with me, Sasha. I've got friends on both sides. My dad's
Okay.
girlfriend is Jewish, so you can just shut the fuck
Bravo.
up.
Adam, I have a question. If these protesters, if they are breaking the laws, and some people will provide financial help to pay for the lawyers and so on, could these people be found that they are actually encouraging and helping these protesters and be also charged for inciting resurrection?
No, they will not be charged for providing representation, but those who are engaged in the protests right now will not have any chance of being acquitted because first, the right to free speech does not allow you to go onto private campuses, private property, and disrupt the educational mission of that institution. And even if it was a public institution, you're not permitted, pursuant to university codes of conduct, to disrupt other students and make other students feel unsafe through harassment and rhetoric like that, which is targeted at Jews. They
Why
should be
is there
expelled
not charged so far? Why are they
because the universities are going to handle this by expelling the students and suspending the students, and that is going to be considered in their eyes a sufficient punishment. And in fact, it will be, because the deprivation of benefits that you suffer when you get expelled from a place like Columbia, UCLA, Northwestern, Duke, North Carolina, USC is very substantial and will be a permanent black mark on their career. So we do have a system that's going to deal with this.
Damn it.
It's just going to be dealt with through university processes rather than burdening the legal system with punishing people who are already going to be punished in a way that irreparably harms their lives.
All right. So I don't find the protests very disruptive compared to Black Lives Matter, compared to when I was a little kid in the Vietnam War protests. During those protests, there were violent confrontations, large-scale confrontations.
If it was the KKK in these encampments, would you find it disruptive?
I just looking at the level of physical confrontation in the 60s, the weathermen, people were blowing up ROTC buildings. People were getting killed at Kent State by the military. I don't see that level of disruption here.
But that's not the minimum level required. I mean, you're talking about severe examples, but that doesn't mean that there's not a minimum.
Like
that's
everybody's
nonetheless-
all like, this is like a huge thing. Is I find most of what's happening reasonably civil and not as disruptive as, well, certainly less disruptive than January 6th.
Well,
than the
look at
less
look at-
widespread than Black Lives Matter protests, less violent than the Vietnam War protests and the police responses to those protests.
Look at Columbia University, where the student protesters are occupying a building such that they had to close the entire campus, where they vandalized property. Look at the Jewish students on these campuses who have to hear Intifada, destroy the state of Israel, genocide for Jews. I suspect that is not only I know that that's not only disruptive, it's despicable and has no place in academia and no place in the marketplace of ideas. And I would submit, Rick, that if it was the KKK doing this, saying kill all blacks, you would find it disruptive. That is the point again and the problem.
I don't think
Adam, what do you say to those folks that are actually, because there are some Jewish population that are even part of the protests pro-Palestine? Matter of fact, I watched one.
Yeah, I don't think most of the protesters are saying kill all Jews
that are part of the Jewish community. So do you have a problem with
Yes,
them?
they are.
You know, so
And it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if 60% of them are peaceful and 40% of them are spreading hate. The net result is that all Jewish students who are paying tuition and have a right to be treated with dignity and fairly and not harassed or be discriminated against are feeling unsafe and threatened. Outside of one of the dorms where Jewish students lived on Columbia's campus, there were horrendous anti-Semitic statements made. They just took over Hamilton Hall at Columbia. The Jews are being marginalized. They are being discriminated against.
Adam,
I guarantee you, if it was KKK, you guys would be up in arms, and so would these universities. But they want to placate these protesters for Palestine. It is hypocrisy at its height and discrimination and racism in fact.
No, hold a second. Adam, first off, there was a protest. I won't say it was a Klan protest in Durham, where I live and everything. And yes, there were people that were protesting in downtown, but they were actually going through downtown and near downtown. And yes, there were people that protested, and that protest that existed in downtown that was before the pandemic. And I was actually downtown when it happened.
I'm fine with arresting people who say kill all Jews. But
I see Rick's point. Rick has a good point, but I think what Rick's point goes to is this. We have to let the Palestinian protesters exercise their First Amendment rights, but there's a time, a place, and a manner in which they should be able to do so. What they're doing now is entirely disruptive. They're vandalizing property, they're threatening students, and the First Amendment jurisprudence by the Supreme Court allows you to regulate where and when and how you disseminate that speech. So you want to march down Fifth Avenue? Go ahead. You want to march down Main Street? Go ahead. You want to have a protest on Columbia's campus for 6 hours? Go ahead. But to be sleeping there night after night after night and then to engage in physical violence by breaking and entering into a building at Columbia is unacceptable. It should never be tolerated, and it is completely antithetical to any society that values diversity.
But isn't that what the Vietnam War did and the civil rights protests? They all broke into buildings. That's what they did at the Allen building.
And they were arrested.
Not all the time. Sometimes they were arrested. Sometimes they had negotiations, because I know in the Allen building, I think they had a negotiation with the then chancellor, and they came up with some concessions. And that's part of what these folks are trying to get.
But Mark, it depends on the context. Okay, if they were marching on a campus peacefully, they were marching on Main Street, Fifth Avenue, in New York, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, fine. But to say that these students on private property can form encampments, spew hate speech, and disrupt the campus so much that they had to cancel classes and at USC graduation, that goes too far, and that's wrong.
So I guess what I'm saying, after listening to everybody here, I'm okay with the protesters for the most part. I'm okay with the responses for the most part. And for the most part, the whole level of unrest is dwarfed by, this is, I think, the fourth time since 1968 that Columbia has been shut down by protests. When I was a kid growing up in Boulder, Colorado, which had a huge amount of hippie protests, people I remember one time a car full of people were trying to build a bomb and they screwed up and they blew themselves up. And we went to the park where they'd blown themselves up, and my buddies and I in 8th grade, just saw all the little pieces of people stuck to the trees. I don't think we're at that level yet.
Well, at Emory University, they were spitting on police officers. At Emory University,
so arrest them. But I still don't think, if you look at the amount of damage, I don't know how you calculate, people not being able to go to class in terms, but like compared to BLM, I don't know. I
Well,
Rick,
okay, you have
Rick, part of the BLM was that there were people. Then I would argue that it's even happening with this protest. There are people sometimes that use opportunity to do their own damage. Because definitely there were some people in BLM that saw the opportunity to destroy buildings and loot buildings because they wanted to get whatever the latest shoe was.
Okay, fine, but I'm without saying who's right or who's wrong. I'm just saying that the amount of disruption and damage caused by these protests is probably much less than the BLM protests.
Rick, that might be true, but that doesn't mean it still isn't wrong, because you don't look at the violence in the aggregate. You don't say, well, the entirety of it isn't that bad, because the truth of the matter is, you look at it on an individual level. Even one individual spewing hate towards Jews in that encampment is enough to disrupt the educational experience for every Jew on that campus. And that is the problem. You don't just say, well, it's not as bad as Kent State or not as bad as BLM, which you're correct in saying. You look at the individual context of what's happening at USC, where the valedictorian can't even speak anymore, where Emory, where a professor
at USC, they
calling for the genocide of Jews in Columbia. But individuals are doing this. So maybe you're right. Maybe 95% of the protests are peaceful. But if 5% of them are not, that is enough to shut these people down, expel them from the university, and create a campus environment that is safe, secure, and stable for every student.
There was another thing going on before October 7th happened, which is since in the past 5 years, there's been much more support for racist activity, and the amount of anti-Semitic hate crimes in the U.S. had already tripled even before October 7th.
That's correct.
And like Twitter, when it was bought by Elon Musk, and he brought everybody back who'd been kicked off of Twitter for saying horrible crap, is now just and like I on Twitter on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, just so many people saying Hitler was right and just putting up anti-Semitic stuff. So even before these, so it's hard to separate the protests and the people in the protests from the assholes who are already hard at work spreading Jewish hate.
But you don't have to separate them. You don't have to separate them. What you have to look at is, what is the effect of the message that they are spreading? And even if there's one person in that group who is spreading that message, that is enough to infect an entire campus with the taint of hate and the presence of inequality and discrimination. And the biggest group in this country that is the victim of hate crimes, it's not black people, it's Jews. So we should be particularly vigilant about providing a space for the Jewish people and reinforcing our common values of equality under the law.
And in terms of the criminal justice system, and a number of other folks, people would argue on that, but we're not going to get into that. There's a whole other show and everything.
But Rick, you make a good point.
But hold a second. Whoopi Goldberg, and that's the other thing I was going to get to, said that she was enraged by this comment that Donald Trump, your favorite person, said, because apparently Donald Trump has said that America is anti-white. He said that there is a definite anti-white feeling in this country, and that can be allowed. And Whoopi Goldberg said, wait a minute, have your people been hung? Have you had some of the things that happened with slavery? So as the only minority voice here at this particular time, what is your thoughts about this notion? And there was some pushback, including from a sister who used to work for Trump and all along those lines, because she was definitely pro-Trump and all in that space. But what is
thoughts on what? Thoughts on what specifically?
Whether the country is more
America is anti-white.
Whether what? I can't hear you. Whether what?
So Trump apparently, according to Mark, Trump said America is anti-white.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't believe that America is anti-white any more than it's not anti-black either. What I think he's referring to is that in specific sectors of society, the admissions process at universities, the hiring process in academia and in other jobs, there is strong favoritism for applicants on the basis of race, namely blacks over whites, for whatever purpose, whether to increase diversity.
That's now illegal. That's been made illegal.
It's not illegal. It just has to be done differently, and it's not illegal in the private sector. So I think what he's referring to is a sentiment that white males do not get the same shot in the application or employment process as women or black people. And I'm not going to express any judgment on that, but that is the sentiment. And there's evidence to bear that out. When you look at the hiring process at universities, you almost uniformly liberals are hired and more women and minorities are hired than whites across the board. That is a problem because, again, we should be committed to equality under the law, not discrimination.
All right, so two things. One is Trump is a cornered rat, and he will say anything at this point to create, a certain amount of chaos to distract from the trouble he's in. Thing one. Thing two is the college admissions process is unfair to everybody. For the super elite colleges, the Ivies and the University of Chicago and Stanford, because like Cornell is the sluttiest Ivy. It lets in 5,000 students a year, which is 3 times as much as the other Ivies, but they let in 68,000 people apply. They only let in 7%. At Harvard, they let in 3%. So regardless of what standards or criteria you put in place, you're going to have a shitload more kids who perfectly meet those requirements who can't get in because 25 times as many kids apply as can get in. And so everybody is going to get screwed over because there's no room. It's a crapshoot for anybody. Which makes the problem worse because if it's a crapshoot at one school, then the obsessive kids who are trying to, be the most driven kids will apply to 20 schools to have that they're rolling the dice 20 times, which creates more applications, which means that the colleges have an even lower acceptance rate.
And these colleges like Cornell, Harvard, Brown, Dartmouth, they claim to all be about diversity and having a diverse student body. Well, guess who they admit? They admit the wealthiest of the wealthy and the most privileged of the privileged. They are not telling the truth. They are protecting an elite privileged class that goes to Hyannisport every summer and that has mansions in the Hamptons. And their commitment to diversity is one that is in name only and only exists in the abstract.
So a certain chunk of the people admitted are rich kids, like Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, not a great student, not great at SAT scores. His dad contributed $2 million to Harvard back when that was a lot of money instead of the average, and he got in, and people were shocked. So there are those. There are elite athletes who still get in, and there are people who have amazing stories. People who've, started their own like multi-million-dollar charities. They from nothing to where or their own corporations, or people who in high school published, legit scientific papers. So you have these, exceptional talents. These crazy stories, just 1 in a million kids, those kids will get in. But then the kids who don't check any of the super exceptional boxes, those kids have like one chance in 50 of getting in. Just the regular kids who work their asses off.
Right. So it's for the people from Martha's Vineyard and for the most exceptional of the exceptional. And then you get the other 99%, the people who are trying to work their way up and have opportunity in society. And guess what Harvard and Yale do? They give them a small letter that says you're rejected. So they're not really caring about upward mobility. They don't care about diversity. They care about admitting students who are going to make them look good as alumni.
That's why the fairest thing that the elite universities could do, and they argue, well, we don't have room to do it, is to double their admission size. But they say, well, no, then we'd have to build more dorms, hire more professors, and we're at the geographic limits of our campus, which is BS. They could, they've got billion-dollar endowments. They could figure out how to make more space.
They're not going to do it because they want to preserve their wealth and their power. They don't care about diversity or equality. They care about preserving the cocoon of elitism that allows them to enjoy the very privilege that they claim is so bad in society. That's why they claim to be socialists but live on Martha's Vineyard. They claim to be in favor of redistribution, but they've just bought the latest $25 million house in East Hampton. They are hypocrites of the highest order and very, very injurious to society inside the classroom where they indoctrinate law students and outside the classroom where they exclude the very people that they claim to want to benefit.
So when institutions fail the people have to develop alternate institutions.
Correct.
Well, and that's partially what they did. I mean, that's part of the reason that HBCUs were created, because some people.
It's hard to do so when you don't have the power.
Institutions, and they didn't have power either, because that's part of the reason that HBCUs were created, was to give the voice and an academic voice to minority students. That was part of the reason that historically black colleges and universities were created, whether that was in the Northeast, the South, or the various other places that they exist. I think there are a couple in Texas.
And increased recognitions of HBCUs is a good thing, because then a kid can bring their, send their resume from, there are elite HBCUs that are, and, 10 years ago, if that resume, some white exec is looking at it, he'd be, I don't know what that is. I don't care about what that is. But now, there's much more coverage, much more acknowledgement that the education and the talent of the people being educated are on a parallel with the elite, the Ivies, then that means, more legit opportunity.
One of the most premier schools in medicine was Morehouse University, which is actually an area that I think Adam knows, because, they're in the Atlanta area and all in that space. But it was definitely a elite university and an elite HBCU, and it's still considered an elite HBCU. That's why people talk about the Morehouse man and all in that space. But definitely that is considered elite one. Sasha, get ready to make your point, and we get ready to get out of here, because we got the other show on.
Very short point. When I was still in Russia, I was a student of university, and Russia, it doesn't matter what are you studying, the medicine, the music, or math, or it just doesn't matter. The most important thing is the theory of communism science. And of course, a premier work of that was Karl Marx, Capital, in German Das Kapital. And not that I loved that work, but I had to read it from beginning to the end. And then I read already when I was here, I read some other works of Marx. I was curious enough to discover that Karl Marx, he absolutely passionately hated Russians. And he thought that this is the most despicable nation in the world, but it's not part of Das Kapital. So when people study in Russia capital, they don't read that. But if they would go a little bit farther and start to explore what else Marx wrote about that. So I'm thinking about this could be, first of all, about Marx, although it was tried to be implemented in Russia, it was very, very unsuccessful experiment, all that now. But if that would be, as Marx was suggested, that the socialism has to come as a result of revolution or other ways in the most advanced capitalist society, which was Russia, was not. That's why it never worked. However, maybe some other time it could work, because it's very difficult to find what is not so right about Marx. He was very detailed in his thinking. Of course, now there are a lot of modern economic theories and so on. So you can, of course, you can argue about some of his points. But overall, not as economic probably study, but most likely as a social study, I'm surprised that people in American university are not learning Karl Marx.
So when he wrote Das Kapital in 1867, and the thing that mostly made him wrong was in the next 150 years, technology changed to the point where, he said that the way history has to work is eventually the workers acquire the means of production. They end up owning the stuff for the benefit of all. But
When is that?
But
where is the workers are owing the?
I don't know. I haven't read it, but I've
Yeah.
read summaries of it. Didn't he say that that was the end of history? Was when workers.
Okay, what he was saying is that the means of production is a major difference between socialist society and capitalist society, because if you don't own means of production, you are just labor workers, nothing else. But in the United States, I never heard that somewhere like any company, you take Philip Morris or you take IBM or you take just anything, you think that workers are own the means of production.
No, but I also think that the world has changed in 150 years. There's one NFL team where the workers own the means of production. The Green Bay Packers is owned by the citizens of Green Bay. So 1 out of 32 teams. So it mostly hasn't happened, but also we've got we're looking at a future where freaking robots make things cheaper and cheaper, and to the point where ideas like capitalism and socialism, communism have to be replaced by some other ism to reflect just a crazy new world that Marx could have, or Keynes, or any of the economists of 100 years ago could have imagined.
Well, what's good topic
is, just 1 second. The Karl Marx, but even more so Vladimir Lenin, they were so 99% against unions. Because they were saying that the unions, they are making some kind of peace with capitalists, and therefore they are against actual workers. So they are the capitalists themselves, because they are trying to extract from owners of the means of production the most favorable conditions for themselves, and they betray the real workers. So they were so much against unions, and I don't understand why unions are still allowed in the United States.
Well, I mean, part of the thing is that the unions in the United States were very much into the camp of communism. So whether that is true, I don't know that or not, even though poli-sci was my minor and everything, but I do know that a lot of the early unions were very much into the pro-communist camp and all in that space. That's part of what the McCarthy trials were about.
Because
the communism and the labor movement were actually interrelated as well.
Okay, so the U.S. was being bullshitted by Russian propaganda. No Americans in the 1930s knew that Stalin was slaughtering tens of millions of his people and that Russia was sinking into famine. That's not what you heard here. Plus, like Hollywood had a certain amount of communist infiltration, because communist ladies would have sex with you even if you were a schmucky writer. So writers go to these commie parties and they get laid, and they're susceptible to being like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I can put in a good word for Russia.
I mean, there was a whole thing on that. We're going to get on out of here. But by the way, I think that just for a couple of things. One, I'm trying to get some of the people that are part of the protest movement to come to either World Edition or some of the other shows, so y'all can give your questions to them directly. I don't know whether they'll be making it or not, but there are some efforts to reach out to them, and y'all can have y'all's opinion as to whether they need to be protesting or not. But really quickly, Adam, Rick, and even you, Sasha, I think we're all going to go out and get a tent, and we're all going to go to our respective colleges and lead a protest. So I expect to see you in your tent.
I'll have a lot better time.
Draw the line at pooping in a bucket. At some campuses, they're pooping in buckets. I'm not going to deal with that.
Mark, I also asked them, how are they paid, by cash or by checks?
Like
and
I
if
said,
you have any of them on this show, I'm not going to be asking them any questions, but I'm going to be saying something to them. I just can't wait for that opportunity.
well,
Let
like I
us
said,
know.
I'm going to go.
we may get that opportunity.
Coffee all over. I got to go get the wet.
Good seeing you all. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.